Recently, a couple of stories have emerged hinting that the Trump era was somehow predicted in literature years ago. I will admit to finding these stories fascinating, even more so when you separate fact from fiction. Let's do that. I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is Later That Same Life. On each episode of my weekly podcast, a different topic, discussion, commentary, or story from our lives.
Season 21, Chapter 10, Conspiracy or Coincidence.
I'll tell you right now, we're not talking about Trump's hair, which has been a topic of focus recently. What are we talking about here? Autocrat I.C. Trumpelman from about 50 years ago? The Adventures of Baron Trump, written well over a century ago. John G. Trump and time travel? Oh yes, those. Plus, Nikola Tesla, Leslie Epstein, Werner von Braun, Elon Musk, Winston Churchill, Humphrey Bogart. It's crazy. When I heard these stories, I found them so incredible that I thought they couldn't possibly be true. But they are. Mostly. What I mean by that is that I've always found it interesting that even though some historical facts are accurate and compelling, there are still those who feel the need to add fiction to the narratives. I understand, these stories lend themselves to conspiracy, even though likely it's all just coincidence. And hey, I'm open. When you hear about strange conspiracies involving those in leadership and power, you often think, well, I wouldn't put it past them. It's easy to be suspicious. I love conspiracy theories. I subscribe to almost none of them, but on their own, they are such good stories. And who doesn't love a good story? As long as we can separate myth from reality, what's the harm of a good conspiracy theory? Theory is always the key word here that most people seem to forget. They just hear conspiracy, and then they seem to fade out by the time the word theory comes out. Theory. Conjecture, hypotheses, speculation. Sometimes it leads you to the truth. Sometimes it doesn't. It's like watching a movie that claims to be based on a true story. Most of us understand that it's probably fictionalized for the sake of the plot, and we accept that. That's kind of the attitude I think we should take with most of today's information. Could be based on a true story, may contain elements of fiction. Do not consume if allergic. So, let's get into these Trump-related conspiracies, coincidences, etc. And I will do my best to point out along the way what is true and what isn't. The first story involves a 1979 novel, a work of fiction called King of the Jews, written by Leslie Epstein. Interesting guy, this Leslie Epstein. Grew up in Hollywood, wrote many novels and essays. Since the 1970s, he was professor of English and director of creative writing at Boston University, actually right up until his passing in 2025 at age 87. Some of his students went on to win book awards, even a Pulitzer. What a talent. And maybe it was in his genes. His father was Philip Epstein. Philip, along with his twin brother Julius, were two of the most prolific screenwriters Hollywood has ever seen. They penned screenplays like The Man Who Came to Dinner, The Last Time I Saw Paris, Arsenic and Old Lace, Casablanca, to name a few. If you are thinking that possibly another well-known Epstein name is coming up here, it is, hang on, Leslie Epstein's novel, remember, came out in 1979, King of the Jews, is a black satire about a man named I.C. Trumpelman. Trumpelman is a power-hungry dictator and a charismatic con man who ends up ruling as a merciless autocrat, forcing his constituents into grim compromises. Well, this certainly has us rubbing our hands together, wondering what it all means. So far, this is all true. It's a real book by a real writer, and that's really what it's about. But now all the machination worms start coming out of the woodwork. Here's what they're adding to this. Author and professor Leslie Epstein bears a striking resemblance to Jeffrey Epstein, the one, the only, the infamous, convicted pedophile and sex trafficker. If you're listening to my podcast on my YouTube channel, you'll see the pictures for yourself. Yeah, they look alike. They could be brothers. Leslie was born in Los Angeles in 1938, Jeffrey in New York in 1953, but perhaps they're half-brothers of the same father. How would that even be possible? Well, here's the fascinating theory. Leslie's father, as mentioned, was the famous screenwriter Philip Epstein. It is historically recognized that Philip and Julius Epstein were politically involved, especially when it came to a movie like Casablanca. Casablanca, under the guise of a romantic melodrama, is known to be an American World War II propaganda film. Humphrey Bogart as Rick Blaine is symbolic of the Americans moving away from isolationism and preaching self-sacrifice in order to defeat the Axis powers led by Nazi Germany.
Here it is. Thanks. I appreciate it. A welcome extra fight. This time I know our side will win.
It had a world premiere in New York City at the end of 1942. But its official release date was January 23, 1943. That was a government request meant to coincide with the actual Casablanca Conference, a meeting in that city of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, at which time they discussed their new alliance along with war strategies. All this to point out that the U.S. government recognized the power of Hollywood and called upon it to do its share in the war effort. As a result, studios, directors, actors, writers, one might say, were drafted into geopolitics. The Allies won World War II, but almost instantly a new enemy, a new fear emerged. Communism. We're talking late 40s, early 50s. One U.S. Senator, Joseph McCarthy, made anti-communism his sole mission, leading to a famous confrontation from attorney Joseph Welch.
Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. Look, you have done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
Should note, too, that McCarthy's Senate investigations were separate from Congress and their infamous House Un-American Activities Committee. But together, they defined the mood of the day. Root out those commies. Studio chief, one of the original Warner brothers, Jack Warner, was what's the word I'm looking for? Dick, who traveled to Washington to appear as a friendly witness. He named names, famously writers like Ring Lardner Jr. and Dalton Trumbo. They were blacklisted as a result of Warner's testimony, raising communism suspicions. Warner also gave up Philip and Julius Epstein. He had had a love-hate relationship with the pair. He loved the fact that they wrote highly successful screenplays, but he hated their progressive politics. Are you following this so far? Because I know there's a lot. Now, the Epsteins were never called to testify, but apparently feared that they might be. And in that time, suddenly, Philip Epstein dies, 1952. He's named by Warner, and then he's gone at age 42. Here's what the conspiracy schemers will tell you next. A short time after Philip Epstein dies in Los Angeles, across the nation in New York, a Seymour Epstein surfaces after an 11-year gap from public records, marries a woman named Paula, and a year later they have a son named Jeffrey. It's alleged that Seymour Epstein entered the U.S. Army back in 1941, and then again the name doesn't appear anywhere in any documents until a marriage certificate in 1952, leading to a couple of competing theories. One, that the original Seymour Epstein was killed, or he went deep cover into Army intelligence. Therefore, a Philip Epstein, the twin screenwriting brother, originally from New York, by the way, Philip, to escape persecution, fakes his own death, assumes the identity of a dead man, relocates back to New York, marries, and has a son, which now explains the family resemblance between author Leslie and criminal Jeffrey. Who would even be able to think of such a thing to do? Why, a screenwriter, of course. Who else would connive such a plot? All very intriguing. As I said, these theories usually make for a good story. Except theorists support their claim by telling you that Philip Epstein died suddenly and mysteriously from unknown causes, and that Seymour Epstein disappeared from the planet, seemingly upon entering the military in 1941 and going to war. Yeah, that all makes sense now. Well, though, in fact, screenwriter Philip Epstein documented as dying in hospital in L.A. after a brief bout with cancer. And Seymour Epstein does appear in military records up to 1945, and then again on records as an employee at several jobs in civilian life around New York. Yeah, I like the first story better. The damn facts get in the way. But how about the resemblance of the two later Epsteins, Leslie and Jeffrey? That's a strange coincidence, isn't it? How do you explain that? Well, they have a name for this in psychology and sociology, the prosecutor's fallacy. This is an error we often commit that makes a normal coincidence look like some sort of magical sign. Generally, we tend to misunderstand coincidences. Firstly, billions and billions of people around the world and billions of events happening every day. Over the years, coincidental things are actually very likely to happen somewhere. Secondly, we notice when coincidences happen, but we ignore all the millions of times they did not. You know, like I was just thinking of a friend, and suddenly they called me. Weird. Even though you thought of them many times before, when they never called. Highlighting our coincidences or treating them as mysteries to be solved is like making rules after the fact. As one researcher put it, it's like firing a gun at a blank wall and then drawing a target around the bullet hole. There's also something called the clustering illusion, believing that random data points to a single trend. Random data, well, they're both named Epstein and they kind of look alike. So what's the obvious answer? They're brothers. Or it's a coincidence. Then there's something we all have, confirmation bias. Write that one down. Confirmation bias is where we look for information to confirm what we already believe, rather than listen to detractors who may shake our foundation. Those people cause us to doubt ourselves. They're no fun. Then add finally the post hoc fallacy. Simply put, all you have to do is say or even think, they look like brothers. And that's enough to plant the seed, the idea that there's something to that. Here is something more logical to explain this. In the late 19th and early 20th century, many immigrants came to America, landing in New York City. Many of the Epsteins who came can trace their origin to the town of Epstein in Germany. Jewish immigrants in New York formed groups called Landsmannschaften. They're like councils or societies. So if you just got off the boat and you were an Epstein, you knew that you had to look for the Epstein Landsmannschaft, because they looked after the Epsteins the way the Birnbaums looked after the Birnbaums. They would take you in, make sure you got some food and shelter, eventually help you find a job. The Irish, the Italians, every immigrant group did some version of this. Is it so impossible that early on, two different Epsteins, possibly had bloodlines, came to New York, found their friendly neighborhoods, and even after generations, had children that resembled each other? That is much less interesting, but more likely what happened. I'm almost third-generation Canadian, but I know there's still Fedorics in Ukraine, and if one of them happened to look like me, I wouldn't be surprised. There's another twist to this chapter. Donald Barr was an American teacher and writer who during World War II worked in intelligence for the OSS. That was the precursor to the CIA. Years later, he ended up as headmaster of the exclusive New York facility, the Dalton School. In 1974, he hired a 21-year-old Jeffrey Epstein to teach math and physics at the school, even though Epstein had no qualifications to teach either of those subjects. Of course, he hired Jeffrey Epstein because he was in Army intelligence. He helped arrange the disappearance of Seymour Epstein, only to emerge later and decided he was going to take care of his son or something. I don't know. Okay, that's not likely, but what is true is that Donald Barr's biological son, William, did go on to be Donald Trump's Attorney General for a while in the first term. Coincidence? But weird. In 1973, Donald Barr had a science fiction book published called Space Relations. This part's true. The story is about a diplomat becoming involved with an oligarchy who owns and sexually enslaves their captives, and they use sexual compromise for political power. Really? That's the guy who hired Jeffrey Epstein to teach school. Part 2. Here's the other one making the rounds. I'll make it quick. In the late 1800s, American author Ingersoll Lockwood wrote a children's novel called Travel and Adventures of Little Baron Trump, and a sequel, Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey. In the books, young imaginative Baron lives in Castle Trump and has a magical mentor named Dawn Fum. In the second book, they find subterranean portals that lead them to eccentric societies beneath Russia. Throughout his travels, the young Baron Trump repeatedly manages to offend local inhabitants, and he has to flee complicated romantic entanglements with local women before eventually making his way back to Castle Trump. Around this time, Lockwood publishes a third book, not a children's novel. It's called The Last President, where he imagines a chaotic post-election America where the rise of a populist outsider triggers class warfare and mass protest. The president, in the book, lives in New York and appoints a vice president named Pence. So far, this is all true, verifiable. But now, the schemers take over the story. They will tell you that author Ingersoll Lockwood lived on the same street as Nikola Tesla. And when Tesla died in a hotel room mysteriously, the CIA swept in to gather up Tesla's papers and research, because Tesla had just invented time travel, and the government wanted to keep that for themselves. On that team making that raid was John G. Trump, Donald Trump's uncle. Okay, it's one thing to make more of a coincidence than there actually is, but now the conspiracy crowd is just inventing coincidences. For one, Ingersoll Lockwood and Nikola Tesla did not live on the same street, like they had no connection to each other at all. Here's actually Lockwood from an old radio broadcast.
I didn't know Tesla. I never lived in his neighborhood. I wish I had that kind of money.
Okay, that clip is fake, mostly AI. I just did it to be a smartass and show you how easy it is. Yeah, but Lockwood and Tesla, not connected. Secondly, Tesla did die alone in a hotel room, but not mysteriously. He had a blood clot near his heart. He was 86. Also, Tesla never invented time travel or ever say that he did, but he did contend that he had something he called teleforce. It was a super weapon which could concentrate rays of matter and then have them travel at high velocity to devastating effect. The press dubbed it the death ray. So, conspiracy people, why fabricate time travel? Death ray sounds pretty good in the story, and it's true. They thought he had a death ray. What else? Oh, well, it was 1943. There was no CIA yet. But apparently military intelligence was concerned that Tesla just may have done it. What if he did figure out a death ray? So they did send a team to gather up Tesla's papers. John G. Trump was not on that team, but he's a real guy. Donald Trump's dad's only brother, and he was a noted electrical engineer. He was a professor at MIT, and he was one of the consultants who was later called in to have a look at Tesla's papers. Was there anything to this death ray thing? And given the technology of the day, there wasn't. Today? Well, maybe hard to tell. If this isn't enough, conspiracy theorists then go on to try and tie Tesla to Werner von Braun, the Nazi rocket scientist. V2 rockets, all that? Turns out there was no connection between those two at all. But in reality, Werner von Braun was never tried for war crimes because the United States felt it was more to their benefit to convert him over to their side. They wanted to use his rocket knowledge to help build up the fledgling post-World War II division they called NASA. Wernher von Braun basically got away with murder and became a NASA scientist. Interesting, huh? How these strange truths do not show up in the conspiracy story. What's also true is that in 1953, von Braun published a work of science fiction called Project Mars, where a Martian colony is run by a man they call Elon. And by the way, Elon was not his name, it was his title. Elon means oak tree. It's like a symbol of stability, leadership. The man was an Elon, I guess. That part probably coincidence. But pretty good, huh? All of that? Pretty good for a fable based on a true story. Hope you enjoyed them. Also enjoyed separating fact from fiction. Trumpelman, Barron Trump, Epstein, Elon, all the rest. I think people actually enjoy coming up with conspiracy theories. Sure, but me, it's even more fun debunking them. What's the old saying? To err is human. To debunk is divine. Well, something like that. I think we do this too because it's so difficult to explain a Donald Trump. Well, not him himself. He's just an asshole. But his rise to power. How did this happen? It's mysterious. So then we look for anything to connect anything to anything else. I don't think that's going to do it. I think we just have to wait it out, get back to a peaceful and civil society, and then hope that history doesn't repeat itself, which of course it always does. That's my theory.
Later That Same Life is written, voiced, and produced by Larry Fedoruk. Larry Fedoruk 37 at gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.